Picture this. It is the year 1347 AD, and you are Margot, only 15 winters old, standing barefoot in the threshold of a smoke-darkened cottage. The feast outside has left the air thick with ale and sweat, and the rushes underfoot crunch softly with each nervous step. A tallow candle burns low, its flickering glow casting long shadows against the stone walls. On the bed, your new husband Henrik waits. He is nearly twice your age, his beard rough, his hands hardened by years of ploughing fields. You did not choose him, he was chosen for you. Your father traded you away for 3 pigs, half an acre of barley, and Henrik's promise to protect your family's farm through the coming winters. Your hands clutch the woolen shift your mother sewed for this night, the same shift she once wore for her own bedding. Before you left, she whispered warnings of duty, of obedience, of silence. And outside the cottage, Henrik's friends are drunk, pounding their tankards on the tables, chanting crude encouragements. They will not leave until proof of consummation is given. This is no story of romance. It is a story of survival. The public ritual of a private act. For us today, a wedding night is imagined as private, intimate, but in Margot's world it was anything but. In the medieval village, the marriage bed was a public stage where family honour, community law and church doctrine all converged. In much of Europe, the bedding ceremony was as important as the marriage vows themselves. Guests would escort the couple to their chamber, sing bawdy songs, and sometimes even undress them before jeering and laughter. Only once the bride and groom were in bed, surrounded by witnesses, would the crowd retreat, though never too far. They waited just outside, listening for signs, the creak of the bed, muffled cries, the proof that flesh had met flesh. In noble courts, this ritual was even more elaborate. Curtains might be drawn, but attendants remained inside, praying over the sheets, sometimes witnessing the act directly. Why? Because without consummation, the marriage could be declared void. In a world where inheritance, property and power hinged on heirs, the act of intimacy was as much a legal seal as a kiss at the altar. Virginity as proof, blood as contract. For Margot, the fear was not only of Henrik's touch but of what came after. The community expected evidence, a bloodstain on the sheets, proof that she had been a virgin and that Henrik had done his duty. If the sheets remained clean, disaster could follow. Whispers of fraud, shame for her family, even annulment. Some women turned to deception, smearing chicken blood or dye on the linen to simulate the expected proof. But if discovered, punishment could be brutal, even deadly. Virginity was not simply a personal state, it was a currency. It determined the price of dowries, the honour of families, and the legitimacy of children. A woman's body was a contract, and her first night of marriage was the sealing of that deal. The church in the bedroom. But the village was not the only judge of the marriage bed. Hovering over Margot and Henrik was another authority, the church. From the writings of early church fathers like St. Jerome to the scholastic philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, sex was tightly regulated. Passion itself was suspicious. Jerome famously declared that a man who loved his wife too ardently was an adulterer in spirit. Aquinas allowed intimacy only when aimed at procreation, and only in one position, the man above, the woman beneath, face to face. Anything else was against nature, and therefore sinful. The rules grew even stricter. No sex on holy days, and nearly half the calendar was holy. No sex during Lent or Advent. No sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or while breastfeeding. Aquinas calculated that a couple might lawfully engage in intercourse on as few as 50 days per year. Imagine Henrik reaching for Margot during Lent. For him, it was his right. For her, it was a mortal dilemma. Obey her husband and risk her soul's damnation, or refuse and risk his anger that could quickly become violence. The community's gaze. Even after the bedding ceremony ended, the marriage bed never truly became private. A bride's swelling belly, or lack thereof, was watched by every pair of eyes in the village. If no child came within a year, whispers would begin. Was the husband impotent? Was the wife barren? Was God punishing them? Failure to conceive was rarely blamed on the man. More often, the woman bore the shame. Some were cast aside, others accused of witchcraft, still others forced into humiliating tests of virginity or fertility. In noble courts, doctors, priests and midwives were called to inspect a queen's body, her intimacy dissected for political ends. For peasants like Margot, the pressure was simpler but no less cruel. Without a child, her place in Henrik's household would always be precarious. The battle within the bed. To Margot, the candlelight flickering across Henrik's face illuminated not only her husband, but the weight of the entire system pressing down upon her. The neighbours waiting outside. The priest who demanded confession if she enjoyed herself too much. The church that warned her every touch might be sinful. The family whose honour lay in the stains on her sheets. Her body was no longer hers. It was an altar, a contract, a battlefield. And as Henrik's calloused hands reached for her, Margot understood with a clarity that froze her blood. From this night forward, her flesh was not her own. The medieval bedroom was not a sanctuary. It was a court of law, a chapel and a prison all at once. Step out of Margot's candlelit chamber for a moment, and into the world of medieval medicine, a world where the body was a mystery, where superstition blended with faith, and where women's flesh was both feared and misunderstood. The female body as defective man. In the 12th and 13th centuries, scholars rediscovered the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, think Galen, Hippocrates, and later Arabic scholars like Avicenna. Their writings shaped European medicine for centuries, but they carried with them strange assumptions. One common belief was that women were simply imperfect men. The female body, they thought, was the same as the male, only turned inside out. The womb was imagined as an inverted penis, the ovaries as hidden testicles. Female flesh was colder, wetter and weaker, an unfinished version of the male ideal. This misunderstanding fueled centuries of prejudice. If a woman was merely a defective man, her body could not be trusted. She was prone to illness, hysteria and sin, pleasure and conception. The mystery deepened when it came to reproduction. Medieval physicians believed that for conception to occur, both man and woman had to climax together. The woman's orgasm was thought to release her seed, which mingled with the man's to form life. This belief had dark consequences. Some jurists argued that if a woman became pregnant from rape, it proved she had secretly enjoyed it otherwise. Conception would not be possible. Courts used this twisted logic to dismiss accusations of sexual violence, condemning countless women to silence and shame. The wandering womb. Perhaps the strangest belief of all was the idea of the wandering womb. Doctors thought that if a woman went too long without sex, her uterus might grow restless and begin roaming around her body. It could press against her lungs, causing choking fits, or rise to her head, creating madness. The cure? Fragrant herbs and fumigations. Doctors would place sweet-smelling flowers near the vagina to lure the womb back down, or foul odours at the mouth and nose to drive it away from the chest. In other cases, the cure was marriage doctors prescribed sex with a husband to anchor the womb in place. Contraception and desperation. Despite the Church's prohibitions, women across Europe sought ways to control fertility. Midwives and wise women whispered secret recipes, drawn from pagan tradition and folk magic. Pennyroyal and rue were brewed into teas believed to prevent or end pregnancy, though often dangerously toxic. Tansy and Queen Anne's lace seeds were taken as contraceptives. In some regions, women carried amulets, charms, or even dried animal parts to ward off conception. Others relied on superstition, tying knots in strings during intercourse, or reciting spells to close the womb. But these remedies were risky. Overdosing on herbs could kill, and if the Church discovered their use, women could be accused of sorcery, a charge that carried the threat of execution. Fertility and the sacred. Childbearing was not just a family matter, it was a religious one. A barren womb was seen as divine punishment. To combat it, couples turned to saints and shrines. At the shrine of St. Margaret of Antioch, protector of women in labour, women prayed with candles shaped like babies. Some lay upon the tombs of saints overnight, hoping holiness would seep into their wombs. Relics were dipped in water, which women then drank in the hope of conceiving. Yet when these holy remedies failed, fear took over. Infertility could break marriages, spark accusations of witchcraft, or even lead to annulment. Childbirth, the final trial. For those who did conceive, danger still loomed. Childbirth was one of the deadliest experiences a woman could face. In some villages, 1 in 3 women might die giving birth during their lifetime. Midwives guided women through labour, armed with herbal remedies, whispered prayers, and experience passed down through generations. But when things went wrong, there was little they could do. Forceps did not yet exist. Caesarean sections were performed only on dead or dying mothers, usually to save the baby's soul through baptism. The Church's teachings often added to the cruelty. Some theologians argued that a woman who died in childbirth might perish in sin because she had yielded to lust in conceiving the child. The very act that killed her could also condemn her soul. The silence of women. Through it all, women's own voices were rarely heard. Most surviving texts on medicine and sexuality were written by men, monks, priests, physicians, trained in universities. Women's knowledge, herbal lore, practical remedies, folk traditions was passed orally and therefore dismissed as superstition or condemned as witchcraft. Yet it was this secret underground knowledge that often saved lives. Without it, many more children would never have been born, and many more mothers would have perished in silence. Margot's world. For Margot, these beliefs shaped every moment of her new life. If she failed to conceive, neighbours would mutter that her womb was cursed. If she grew sick with hysteria, her husband might blame her wandering womb. If she sought herbs to prevent another pregnancy, she risked being branded a witch. Her body was not her own, not in the eyes of her husband, not in the law, not in the church, not even in medicine. She was trapped in a web of superstition, doctrine, and fear. And yet, women like Margot endured. They found small ways to resist, to heal, to help one another survive. For in a world where the female body was misunderstood, feared, and controlled, resilience itself became an act of rebellion. Step back into the narrow streets of Margot's village. The bells ring for mass. Gossip flows like wine, and every neighbour watches her steps. For in the Middle Ages, a woman's greatest treasure was not her dowry, nor her beauty, nor even her fertility. It was her virginity, the fragile key to her family's honour. Virginity as currency. In medieval Europe, virginity wasn't simply about purity. It was a kind of currency, one that determined a girl's marriage prospects, her family's reputation, and her worth in society. A daughter who entered marriage untouched brought honour. A daughter who lost her virginity outside of wedlock could ruin her kin. Fathers and brothers guarded female chastity with vigilance, not only out of morality but also out of economics. A deflowered girl was worth less on the marriage market. In noble circles, entire political alliances could collapse if a bride's chastity was questioned. Proof of purity. But how could one prove virginity? The answer was both humiliating and unreliable. Some midwives were tasked with examining brides on their wedding night, searching for signs of intactness. Others claimed to test by inserting a feather, or by watching whether the girl's urine frothed when mixed with certain powders. Of course, none of this was scientific. Hymens could break through riding, climbing, or accidents long before marriage, and yet suspicion clung to women like a shadow. A single whisper of lost chastity could destroy a life. The bloodied sheet. Perhaps the most dramatic ritual came on the wedding night itself. After consummation, the sheets were displayed to the gathered family, or even the village, stained with blood that supposedly proved the bride's virginity. But what if there was no blood? Panic could spread. Some brides secretly pricked themselves with pins or carried small vials of animal blood to smear on the linens. Others prayed desperately that their bodies would produce the proof society demanded. For women like Margot, the wedding night was not just about sex, it was about survival. Virginity and religion. The Church, too, exalted virginity. Saints like Agnes, Cecilia, and Lucy were venerated for refusing marriage and choosing martyrdom rather than losing their chastity. For nuns, virginity was a vow that elevated them above married women. The Church claimed virgins belonged not to earthly husbands, but to Christ himself. Some theologians even argued that virgins were closer to angels than to ordinary mortals. And yet, a contradiction lingered. While virginity was praised, women were still expected to marry and bear children. Too much purity threatened the very foundation of family and society. Thus, women lived caught between two impossible ideals, the saintly virgin and the fertile mother. Honor and shame. In the village, honor was everything. If a girl was seduced, even against her will, her reputation could collapse. Neighbors whispered, families quarreled, and sometimes feuds erupted. Courts often treated women not as victims but as criminals. A woman who accused a man of rape might be forced to prove she had fought hard enough to resist. If she conceived, judges sometimes dismissed her claim, insisting that pregnancy proved consent. Meanwhile, men's honor was rarely questioned. A young knight who boasted of seductions gained prestige. A woman, in contrast, risked disgrace, exile, or even violence from her own kin. Virginity for sale. Not all chastity was guarded. In some cases, virginity was commodified, especially in cities where prostitution flourished. Wealthy clients paid extravagant sums for virgins, believing sex with them brought health or cured disease. Some desperate families sold their daughters to brothels, where their first time was auctioned to the highest bidder. This grim trade revealed the cruel paradox of the medieval world. Virginity could both exalt a woman and enslave her. Margot's fear. For Margot, these realities pressed heavy. She had arrived at her wedding terrified not only of her husband, but of the whispers of neighbors. Would she bleed? Would she be believed? Would she be honored or shamed? Her body was a battlefield of expectations, to be pure but also fertile, submissive yet flawless, a virgin for her husband, yet ready to bear his heirs. The weight of honor was not hers to carry alone. It belonged to her entire family, her household, her lineage. Virginity lost, control gained. Paradoxically, once a woman's virginity was gone through marriage, force, or scandal, her value shifted. She was no longer a commodity of chastity, but a vessel of fertility. A wife's role was to produce children, and so long as she did, her past could sometimes be forgiven. But if she failed to conceive, suspicion returned. Was she barren? Was she cursed? Had she sinned in secret? The cycle of judgment never ended. The court of public opinion. Ultimately, the true power lay not in biology, but in community. Virginity was not measured by hymens or blood, but by the words of neighbors, the decisions of priests, the authority of men. Women lived under constant surveillance, their bodies policed by gossip as much as by law. One misstep, a glance, a rumor, a silence too long could strip away honor forever. The bigger picture. Virginity in the Middle Ages was less about sexuality and more about control. By regulating women's bodies, society reinforced patriarchal power, ensured property inheritance, and preserved fragile reputations. It was not just a personal matter, it was a public one, a thread woven into the fabric of law, religion, and daily life. For women like Margot, there was no escape. From cradle to grave, her body was never truly her own. The medieval village seemed quiet on the surface ploughed fields, church bells, market days. But behind closed doors and beneath cloisters of silence, passions stirred. For though society tried to cage women with laws, doctrines, and gossip, desire found ways to break free. Courtly love, a dangerous fantasy. In the 12th century, across the courts of France and beyond, a new idea began to spread. Courtly love. Troubadours sang of noble ladies adored from afar, knights pledging loyalty not to kings but to the women who inspired them. These songs painted love as spiritual, elevating passion into an almost sacred bond. But beneath the poetry was something subversive. Courtly love often celebrated desire outside marriage between a knight and a married noblewoman, or a lady and her secret admirer. To a peasant like Margot, these tales sounded like fantasies, but they were dangerous ones. They suggested that love could exist beyond duty, that pleasure might be found in forbidden places. Adultery, a deadly gamble. For those who acted on such fantasies, the risks were severe. Adultery was not just a personal sin, it was a crime against family honor and inheritance. A woman who bore another man's child threatened the very bloodlines upon which medieval society rested. Punishments were brutal. Noble women caught in affairs could be locked in convents, their lovers executed. Among peasants, adulteresses risked public shaming, beatings, or banishment. And yet, stories abound of women who risked it all. In village tales whispered by firelight, a miller's wife sneaks out to meet her lover, or a lord's lady entertains a knight while her husband rides to war. Desire, it seemed, could not be extinguished, no matter the cost. Clandestine marriages and secret unions. Not all forbidden love was adultery. Sometimes it was marriage itself that broke the rules. The church taught that marriage was valid if two people exchanged vows even in private, without witnesses or priests. This loophole led to countless secret unions, where lovers wed without their family's approval. But these clandestine marriages often ended in disaster. Without proof, women were vulnerable. A man could later deny the vows, leaving her disgraced. Courts overflowed with cases of women claiming to be wives, while men insisted they were not. For Margot, such tales were warnings. Love without approval was fragile, and women usually paid the highest price. The double standard. Desire was judged differently for men and women. A husband might visit brothels without destroying his honor, but a wife who strayed could lose everything. Priests thundered against female lust, portraying women as temptresses like Eve, luring men into sin. And yet, men's desire was quietly tolerated. Kings and nobles openly kept mistresses, fathered illegitimate children, and flaunted their affairs. For women, there was no such freedom. Their bodies were bound to reputation, while men's bodies roamed unchecked. Forbidden love in the cloister. Even the church, which preached chastity, that was not free from scandal. Monks and nuns sometimes broke their vows, sneaking into each other's cells under the cover of night. Chronicles tell of abbots with secret children, of convents where pregnancies were quietly hidden, of priests who kept concubines despite strict rules. Theologians condemned these acts as abominations, but the temptations of the flesh proved difficult to silence. Even in the most sacred spaces, desire whispered its dangerous song. Love and magic. When passion could not be won honestly, some turned to magic. Love potions brewed from herbs, animal parts, or even menstrual blood were sold in secret by wise women and healers. Charms were whispered over cups of wine, spells carved into rings or sewn into clothes. But magic was risky. If discovered, a woman could be accused of sorcery. Worse, many of these potions were toxic, leading to illness or death. Still, the demand never ceased, proof that love and lust were stronger than fear. The stories that survived. Medieval literature is filled with tales of forbidden love. Consider Tristan and Isolde, where a knight and his king's bride drink a love potion and are doomed to passion and tragedy. Or Lancelot and Guinevere, whose affair nearly destroys King Arthur's realm. These stories thrilled audiences not just because they were romantic, but because they revealed the dangerous tension between duty and desire. They reminded listeners that love could uplift, but also ruin. Margot's choices. For Margot, the stakes were clear. If she strayed from her husband, she risked not just her reputation, but her life. And yet, she was human. Perhaps she dreamed of the handsome farmhand with kind eyes, or remembered the troubadour's songs about secret lovers. Desire was not something she could confess, not to her priest, not to her neighbours, not even to herself. It lingered like smoke in the air, present but unspoken, a reminder that even in a world of rules and punishments, the heart had its own will. Love has resistance. In the end, forbidden desire was more than sin. It was a kind of resistance. Every secret kiss, every hidden tryst, every whispered vow outside the church's approval was a rebellion against a world that sought to control women's bodies. Desire, though dangerous, gave women a taste of agency. It reminded them that their hearts were their own, even if their bodies were not. The Middle Ages were not only a time of passion, superstition, and rigid morality, they were also a time of fear. Fear of women's bodies, fear of lust, and fear of the unseen forces that might control both. For Margot, that fear was ever present, for at any moment, the whispers of neighbours could turn into something far more dangerous, an accusation of witchcraft. Women as the root of sin. From the pulpit, priests thundered that Eve had doomed mankind with her apple, that Delilah had betrayed Samson with her charms, that Jezebel had lured kings into ruin. Women, they said, were the doorway through which sin entered the world. This teaching stained daily life. If cows failed to give milk, if crops withered, if storms destroyed, field suspicion often fell on women. A widow who lived alone, a midwife who knew too many herbs, a wife who dared to speak too freely, any of them might be accused of dark dealings with the devil. Sexuality and sorcery. In the medieval imagination, sexuality and witchcraft were often entwined. The devil, they believed, tempted women not only with riches or power, but with lust itself. Accused witches were said to have carnal relations with demons, their bodies desecrated by unholy unions. Theologians claimed that succubi female demons seduced men in their sleep, stealing their seed to create monsters. Incubi, their male counterparts, preyed on women, often blamed for unexplainable pregnancies. For a woman like Margot, whose womb was the subject of endless scrutiny, even the mystery of childbirth could make her suspect. A healthy baby born after a long history of miscarriages might be hailed as a miracle, or denounced as the work of the devil. The midwife's burden. Few women lived closer to danger than midwives. They were essential to their communities, guiding women through childbirth, offering herbs and easing pain. Yet their knowledge made them targets. If a child was stillborn, if a mother died in labour, if herbs caused illness, and suspicion turned quickly to accusations of witchcraft, the midwife, who had tried to help, became the scapegoat. Margot might one day rely on such a woman to save her life in childbirth, but she knew too that the same woman might be dragged before the village priest, accused of poisoning babies or consorting with the devil. The Church and the Devil's Pact. By the late Middle Ages, fear grew sharper. The Church began codifying the idea of the witch's pact with Satan, a deliberate choice to serve the devil in exchange for power. Manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, 1487, taught inquisitors how to spot, interrogate and condemn witches, with particular focus on women's supposed lust and weakness. Though Margot lived before the height of the witch hunts, the seeds of fear were already there. The groundwork had been laid. Women's sexuality was dangerous, their knowledge suspicious, their independence intolerable. Punishments and persecutions. Punishments for accused witches varied. Some were fined or forced to confess before the village. Others were exiled, driven into poverty and despair. In darker cases, women were whipped, mutilated, or burned alive at the stake. Even when executions were rare, the threat was real. The mere whisper of witch could destroy a woman's reputation, break her family, and leave her isolated. Margot knew that if her neighbours ever saw her gathering herbs, or if her child sickened after she whispered a prayer over him, she might be next. Witchcraft and women's power. At its core, the fear of witchcraft was really fear of women's power. Women who stepped outside their assigned roles, whether as healers, lovers, or independent widows, challenged the structures of patriarchal society. Calling them witches was a way of silencing them. It stripped them of authority, turned neighbours into enemies, and justified violence under the guise of piety. Yet women resisted. They shared their remedies in whispers, helped one another in secret, and preserved knowledge passed down from mothers to daughters. In doing so, they defied the silence that men tried to impose. Margot's shadow. For Margot, the threat of witchcraft accusations lingered like a shadow. Each day, she measured her words carefully, kept her eyes lowered, and guarded her small acts of defiance. She knew that if her husband grew angry, he might accuse her. If her child died, neighbours might blame her. If she sought out herbs to ease her pain, she might be branded a witch. It was a world where a woman's body was not only controlled but criminalised. The larger fear. Why such fear? Because sex, fertility and women's bodies lay at the very heart of medieval survival. Crops failed, plagues swept through towns, children died before reaching adulthood. In such a fragile world, people needed explanations, and often those explanations pointed to women. By branding women as witches, society projected its deepest fears onto them. Fear of death, fear of desire, fear of the unknown. A world on edge. Though Margot's life played out in a small village, she was part of a wider story. Across Europe, thousands of women would eventually be accused, tortured, and executed in waves of witch hunts that lasted into the 17th century. Her own age was only the beginning, but already The tension was there, the fragile balance between woman as mother, healer, and nurturer, and woman as temptress, sinner, and witch. Margot's world may have seemed like a cage, her body owned by her husband, her honor judged by neighbors, her soul policed by the church, and yet, even in this cage, women found ways to breathe. They built networks of trust, carved out spaces of independence, and wielded forms of power that often went unseen. Survival was not passive, it was an act of quiet resistance. The power of work. Though men claimed authority, women's labor was essential. In fields, villages, and cities, women worked side by side with men, sowing crops, brewing ale, tending animals, spinning wool, and selling at market. Ale making, for example, was once almost entirely women's work. The brewster or alewife brewed beer at home to feed her family or sell to neighbors. In some towns, successful alewives grew wealthy enough to own property, though men soon tried to push them out of the trade. In Margot's village, work was survival. Her hands blistered from grinding grain, her back ached from hauling water, her mind stayed sharp as she bartered in the marketplace. In labor, she found not just necessity but dignity. Midwives and wise women. Beyond daily labor, women also preserved knowledge, especially about health and childbirth. Midwives and wise women carried remedies passed from generation to generation, herbs for fevers, poultices for wounds, prayers for protection. Though often mistrusted by the church, these women held authority in their communities. When pain struck, neighbors turned to them, not priests. Their knowledge was not written in books but lived in memory, whispered from mother to daughter. Margot herself might one day kneel before such a woman in childbirth, her life in the midwife's hands. In that moment, female knowledge would matter more than any priest's sermon. Friendship and sisterhood. Women also survived through one another. In villages, bonds of female friendship offered protection. Women met at wells, in kitchens, and at fields, sharing stories, gossip, and advice. They warned each other of abusive husbands, helped one another hide pregnancies, or secretly brewed herbs to bring relief. These small acts built networks of solidarity. For Margot, laughter at the well or whispers by the fire could mean the difference between isolation and strength. Her sisters in struggle gave her courage, reminding her she was not alone. Women in religion. For some, survival came through faith, but also through reinterpreting it. Nuns and mystics, though bound to vows of chastity, carved out unusual spaces of power. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen or Julian of Norwich became respected visionaries, their writings shaping theology itself. Even laywomen found spiritual voice. Margot might not read or write, but she could join processions, keep household shrines, or pray to saints who seemed closer to women's lives than to men's sermons. Religion, though restrictive, also gave women language for their suffering, and sometimes a shield against men's control. Subtle acts of defiance. Not all resistance was loud. In fact, most was invisible. Women bent rules rather than broke them, creating small freedoms within strict boundaries. A wife might hide coins from her husband, ensuring food for her children if he wasted money on drink. A mother might secretly teach her daughter herbal knowledge, passing power through quiet lessons. A young bride might barter affection in bed to gain gentler treatment or greater say in household matters. These were not rebellions written in chronicles, but they were rebellions nonetheless. Margot's every hidden smile, every unspoken choice, was an assertion of self. Widowhood, a taste of freedom. One of the few times a woman could gain true independence was widowhood. Without a husband, a widow could inherit property, manage her own household, and make decisions for her family. Some became powerful figures in their communities, respected for their wisdom and wealth. But widowhood was double-edged. A lone woman could also be vulnerable, a target for accusations of witchcraft or pressure to remarry. Still, for many, it was the closest they ever came to freedom. Margot might secretly dream of widowhood not from malice, but from a yearning to breathe without oversight. The marketplace of words. Even gossip, often seen as women's weakness, could become a form of power. Women's voices shaped reputations, settled disputes, and influenced community life. A clever tongue could protect an ally, ruin an enemy, or shift the balance of honor. Margot learned quickly that silence was not always survival. Sometimes, a well-placed word at the well or in the market stall was a weapon sharper than any blade. Love as a weapon. Even within marriage, women could sometimes wield power through intimacy. While husbands held legal control, wives often managed households, decided daily routines, and, through affection or withdrawal, influenced their husbands' moods and choices. It was a fragile form of agency, but one that mattered. A smile, a refusal, a whispered word in bed could change the course of a household. Margot knew that her body was policed, but she also knew it could not be entirely controlled. The secret strength. Ultimately, women's survival was not about grand revolutions, but about persistence. Through work, knowledge, friendship, faith, and quiet defiance, they endured. Margot's story, though fictional, echoes countless real women whose names are lost. They did not write books or lead armies, but they raised children, healed wounds, resisted silence, and carried traditions forward. Their strength lay not in overthrowing the system, but in outlasting it. A glimpse of power. For a moment, imagine Margot years later not a frightened girl, but a woman grown, her hands strong from work, her voice steadier, her children gathered at her skirts. She still lives under rules she did not choose, but she also carries knowledge her mother never spoke, friendships that shield her, and scars that prove she has survived. Her story is not one of freedom, but of endurance, and in that endurance lies a hidden power.